Hello.
Hello.
Hello
Hello.
to you, Charles. Very glad that you could join us today, and very glad that you've been participating in almost all our economics of happiness conferences and in our international alliance. I know you haven't been well recently, so I'm particularly grateful that you could join us today. And you do look very well now, so
Thank you.
I
I'm
hope you
happy
have
to
most
happy
of
to be
the
here.
problems behind you. So we're talking about a theme that many people think of as rather heavy and depressing, but I think both of us have a sense that if people could just get their head around these issues, they may not be as difficult to solve as many people think. Doesn't mean that we're not facing very serious crises because of this debt-based global economy, but uh, it's really, as far as I'm concerned, mainly a consequence of blindness that we're in this situation where global banks and corporations have so much power. And I think the blindness has meant that many well intentioned people have promoted aspects of this system that have fueled a situation where banks and corporations are now.
Well, wonder if anyone can hear me. I can maybe fill in here while we're waiting for Helena to come back. Um, can someone indicate that I'm being heard? Somehow? Yes.
Essentially a de facto global government. Uh,
Oh, we've lost Helena again. Okay, well, I would like to, I'm just going to fill in. Helena mentioned um, that it's a heavy topic. And I thought, there's nothing more that lends itself better to metaphors of heaviness than debt. We speak of a debt as a burden or the onus of debt or being weighed down by debt. So it is, in more ways than one, a heavy topic. And just to interject a little bit of lightness, a little bit of levity, maybe even, to this heavy topic, I'd like to point out that debt is, on a physical level, nothing but a social agreement. And it could literally be waved away at the stroke of a pen. So when we look at, say, the national debt or the foreign debt or the third world debt and see how many trillions of dollars it is and how much that apportions out to each individual person and how inescapable it is and how we can never pay it back and how we are consigned to an infinite, interminable uh, future of debt and debt and debt endlessly. You got to take that with a grain of salt. That is only true because of the systems of agreements that we call international finance, international trade agreements, which I'm sure Helena would love to talk to us about. But all of these things are agreements among human beings. Therefore, they are only as durable as these agreements among human beings, and they could be changed by new agreements. So one of the things that I think is really valuable about the work that Helena has been doing and local futures is that they are delegitimizing the story that's called debt. A part of that story is that a good person, a responsible person, pays his debts. And if you don't pay your debts, then you're being immoral. But when we recognize that these debts have been created through systemic um, agreements that are based on power, centralized power, then they no longer um, seem as if they're just part of the fabric of reality. And we realize we're empowered to change them. They're only as legitimate as the power arrangements that gave birth to them. So anyway, Helena's back, and I just gave you a nice segue into global trade agreements and things if you want to take that up.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think that the way that trade and finance deregulation has paved the way for this de facto government of global corporations and banks is incredibly important. And I just want to say, first of all, that the most encouraging thing is that there is a powerful movement growing rapidly now to resist the further deregulation of trade and finance. Because in these treaties, they have mechanisms called ISDS clauses, investor state dispute settlements, that commit governments to signing in black and white that corporations and banks will be able to sue them if they do anything that might threaten their profit-making potential. So that means France has been sued for increasing the minimum wage. It means that Germany has been sued by a Swedish nuclear power company because they decided to phase out nuclear after Fukushima. This is madness, and I really believe that no sane person would agree to this. But it's been happening in secrecy, but not as the type of conspiracy that many people think of. The secrecy is more to do with the complexities, the teams of lawyers, the well-paid lawyers working for the corporate lobbies, and the fact that on the surface, more trade between the US and China, between Australia and Europe, must be a good thing. And unfortunately, even many environmental activists and social activists have not realized that the process was actually about this handing over of democratic power, and that it was leading to incredible waste in trading things that can be produced locally and nationally. The process started in a formal way after the Second World War, when they set up what we call the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and very importantly, the GATT, which was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Many of the architects of this, many of the politicians, and I knew some of them personally, were convinced that this was necessary in order to avoid another world war and in order to avoid another depression. And the agenda was, let's incorporate all economic activity under one umbrella, the World Bank, the IMF, and let's have these trade treaties that make sure that we create so-called interdependence between countries. And the propaganda has been that countries that trade don't go to war. Well, it's not true, but a lot of the people who have been promoting it have believed it. And above all, the key thing to realize is that what happened was that this was a treaty, a red carpet for the global traders who were already very powerful from slavery and colonialism. So the debt and the incredible scale of the debt that we have now is a consequence of banks having been given more and more freedom to play around with mechanisms that were already very shonky, already at the beginning of this whole global economy with its trade that emanated from Europe and basically created slavery, genocide, and then colonialism was favoring the rich traders, the global traders, and that included the banks. And they started by already back in the 1400s, slightly wonky accounting that led to what's called fractional reserve, where it meant that the banks weren't at all storing our money in their banks the way we thought they were. But the important thing is to realize that where we are today, this escalation, which really has had a 500-year trajectory, has now become obvious, and more people are joining this opposition to further trade and finance deregulation in treaties like TTIP and TPP. So, Charles, over to you. You can add something to that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you heard the part when you phased out for a while, but I was talking about how this weight, this burden, this heavy, because you were talking about a heavy topic of debt, is really just based on agreements, and the agreements gain their legitimacy from a deeper narrative that is very much part of this kind of idealistic, well-meaning attempt to globalize finance and to encourage what is called development. So if you accept fundamentally that development along the model of the West is a good thing, that a society will benefit from more schools, more hospitals, more highways, more industry, more cities, and all of that. If you see our own society as the apex of human development and believe that everybody else should follow this path, then it's really hard to escape the legitimacy of debt, because most of this debt was incurred through development loans. So, we'll say, okay, Peru or Bolivia or some other country, we're going to lend you $50 billion, and you're going to use that to develop mines and infrastructure and ports and highways and things like that. And then you're going to dig up the minerals and cut down the trees, and you're going to sell all these things and generate even more than $50 billion in foreign exchange, and you'll be able to pay us back. And so we'll make money because we're going to get paid back with interest. And you backward third world people, you will become more like us. You will develop industry by doing this. And so if you believe that narrative, then the debt maybe isn't such a bad thing. And if a country is having trouble paying off its debt, it means that it hasn't really been that good at following this trajectory, unlike Korea or Taiwan or Thailand or somebody who's been doing a very good job because they work hard and are succeeding at this export model. So I think that one thing that initially really attracted me to Helena's work is that she also disrupts that narrative on that level. And really, through your life experience, Helena, you had firsthand experience that showed you that there is a problem with this narrative, that the whole idea that we are at the apex of something called development, some linear process called development, that should be exported to the rest of the world along with freedom and democracy, that there's a problem with that. And I think that there's a growing doubt that is, I think, the most, it's a very important ally, this doubt, in our struggle against the trade treaties. Because unlike maybe 50 years ago in our society, at this apex of development, we look out on the world and we're like, this really maybe isn't working very well. It's not bringing its promised results. All of our institutions are in crisis. It's not like it was 50 years ago. And so the legitimacy, people talk about illegitimate debts and legitimate debts, but I think that there's even a deeper illegitimacy that is emerging now as we question the high-tech modern way of doing things in every field, from medicine to, I think some of the most important ones are medicine, education, and agriculture, where the high-tech way is just not as attractive because it's just not working.
Well, I would say it's a disaster. I think part of what's happened, as I imagine many of the people who listen are familiar with our work, but I'll just briefly say thank you, Charles, for that invitation to talk about the experiences in Ladakh and my book, Ancient Futures, and the film Ancient Futures, which many people still use to precisely spell out what Charles was saying, that this development model simply isn't working. Unfortunately, in most parts of the world, it's not so clear to see how disastrous the model is, because there had been previous years of slavery and colonialism. So there was a lot of poverty, a lot of mass poverty in urban slums and so on. So well-intentioned Westerners coming in to help were much more easily going to be thinking, that we must introduce Western-style schooling and Western-style healthcare and so on. Whereas my experience in Ladakh and in Bhutan was that I had the privilege of getting to know cultures that had not been colonized. And there I found among the healthiest, happiest people I've ever encountered. And it took me about a decade to realize just how genuine that happiness was, and even the health. I mean, I had doctors out there who did research and ended up working in Ladakh now over a 40-year period. And, you know, it's been a very, very dramatic case study of how this overarching development ideology and the global economy essentially destroy local self-reliance, economies that are based on their own resources, where people have developed ways, evolved ways over many generations to make a living out of the products that grow, the fish in the sea, the trees, the plants, the animals that thrive in diverse climates and in diverse ecosystems. People have evolved ways of building their houses, producing their food, providing for all of their needs from those local resources. And trade was something that was where you had a bit of excess production and you brought in luxuries. You weren't dependent on global trade for your everyday needs. Today, we have in place a system where our governments are separating us further and further from the sources of the food that we need on a daily basis. We can't imagine a more inefficient system. Anyway, I saw how the destruction of that diversified local economy, how it happened, and it happened partly through Western style education, where children learned not a word about how to produce anything they needed from their local resources. In fact, it became obvious that in the years from the first year of school until the 10th year of school, they actually learned nothing about production for basic needs at all. In order to learn how to produce food, they then went on to agricultural college or engineering college or becoming lawyers or doctors, all within a Western corporatized system. And that meant learning how to use resources which were not locally available. So you had literally the experts bringing in Jersey cows to Ladakh, which is up at 12,000 feet. Those Jersey cows couldn't even walk up to the grazing land. So you had to import industrially produced pellets to feed them. Now, this is a typical example of what's happening. But maybe most dramatic of all was the human factor, where I saw people now through Western schooling being told that they need to get a good job, the good jobs, the jobs, all of them in the city. And so you saw this absolute, like a giant hook pulling people away from local, diversified, more land-based economies, smaller towns, smaller villages, into the ever-growing capital city where fossil fuel-based jobs were available in a very small number. Almost overnight, you saw how greed was created in the traditional context as the food was available, as the dependence on other people in the village and in the region was there, accessible, human scale, face to face. The type of greed that emerged in the city was non-existent. In fact, I would say greed as we know it was non-existent. What happened in the city is suddenly there you are, everything you need, the water you drink, the food you eat, it's all dependent on money. Now, you don't know if the price of a loaf of bread tomorrow is going to be 10% more or 20% more. You have no idea. It's not strange that people would become neurotically keen to hoard money in this situation of inflationary crisis, total dependence on this enormous, strange thing that has no value of its own. You can't eat the money, you can't drink it, you can't use it in any way to provide for your real needs in and of itself. So This is why for us at Local Futures, it's been so important all these years that we try to raise awareness about looking at the system that creates greed rather than focusing on innate human greed, which of course in traditional cultures, like all the indigenous cultures, including the Buddhist cultures of the Tibetan region, they had a worldview that reminded people that greed was a very negative frame of mind that would only cause misery. They call it attachment. They brought in teaching children already at an early age that attachment would make you unhappy. So they actually, not only did they not have the structures that so dramatically create greed, but they actually had a preventative worldview that encouraged cooperation, that encouraged an open and essentially a message that compassion for others, for everything that lives, and wisdom, and holistic understanding of what's happening around you and to you. Those are the paths to happiness and to peace in the world. Over to you, Charles. I hope I wasn't talking too long.
No, very stimulating. I'm noticing a parallel between our attitude toward greed, the conventional attitude toward greed, and the attitude toward poverty and hunger and things like that. In both cases, we tend to attack a symptom as if it were the root cause. So, you were talking before about how, I'm going to kind of paraphrase, in the context of the results of colonialism, which could be mass poverty and starvation and stuff. And in that context, when everyone's already been dispossessed of their land, when everyone's already crowded into slums and starving, then it certainly looks like a few factories and some more employment would be a good thing, and some better education so that they can outcompete the people in all the other slums in the world. If you take that set of circumstances for granted and adopt this kind of ahistorical view that doesn't recognize that more development is just on a continuum with the development that already happened, then yeah, I mean, what alternative is there? By the same token, if you, I think it's really insightful that when you say that greed is produced by the institutions of our society, so to attack the greed that is produced without changing the context that generates the greed, you're going to end up in continual war. Continual war is the hallmark of the dominant civilization on this planet, and it applies to everything, to agriculture, to medicine. It's a war on weeds, a war on pests, a war on germs. So in a healthy culture, greed is almost irrational, because your well-being, your happiness, and your security doesn't come from controlling lots of resources. It comes from being at the nexus of flow. If you've given a lot and contributed a lot, then you're going to have generated much gratitude in the community, and people will take care of you if you're ever in a situation where you're in need of help. But to have that happen, you have to have ties of giving and receiving to the people around you. And in our modern economy, more and more, the ties that we have are anonymous and abstract. So in theory, there is a farmer somewhere who produced your food when you eat at McDonald's, but the connection with that farmer is so tenuous that it might as well not exist at all. And if that farmer dies, then it's not going to change your experience of life, because there will be another one to take his place. So to overcome greed, it's not just this spiritual endeavor where you sit in meditation and try to let go of things. Yeah, those are valuable practices, but there is a systems dimension, a political and social dimension to those things, to create structures that mirror the psychological structures of enlightenment or of non-attachment. And so those structures, basically, they have to They have to reflect the truth of the other Buddhist truth of interdependency. It has to be, and so the more visible your interdependency is with the humans and non-humans around you, the less greed makes sense. Because if you are in an experience of interdependency, you know that your well-being depends on the well-being of all those around you. Therefore, it's not a competition to see who gets there first and can tromp on everybody else, and you're the winner and they're the losers, and then you're going to be better off. That's not like that when we're in direct connection to the beings around us. And that's why localization, which means to recover some of those ties, to bring them back to a place where we can recognize them, where we can see the mutuality, that's why that's such an important part of our planetary healing. Because then these spiritual truths are made manifest in daily life, and we no longer have this division between the material and the spiritual.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's always so eloquent and very good at rephrasing what we're trying to say. And yes, absolutely, that's our experience, and that's why, for a very long time, we've been proponents of what we call localization. Another term is decentralization, because it's about decentralizing the economic activity, taking back that power from those global banks and corporations into a multitude of much smaller businesses and structures. And as you were saying, Charles, in those smaller structures, where you have a relationship between the natural resources on which you depend, and let's remember, we're talking here about living entities, as the Buddhists would say, sentient beings. So our natural resources are not just some sort of dead, inert matter. The planet is alive. And so we're dependent on life. And we need, as Charles was saying, we need to be able to see what our impact is on that life in order to act in a caring, in a compassionate and wise way. How on earth are we going to be able to make the right choices when the production, the use of life is on the other side of the world? We are dependent on mediated information. And I just give you an example of how difficult it is in that situation. There are some people in big businesses who are dedicated to trying to produce things more ethically. Well, what we are told by the producers in the so-called third world is that when they send out their people to make sure that the labor standards are okay, the hygiene is okay, people aren't overworking, everything is cleaned up and changes for those few days. And when they're gone, it goes back to the same old ways. So even when you have really well-intentioned people in these giant enterprises, it's extremely difficult to actually see or really see what's going on. Now, it's not only that, because it turns out that we have so many other reasons why we need to localize, which include reducing our dependence on unnecessary transport. In a time of climate change, in a time of serious pollution from the use of fossil fuels and most of our other energy sources, even solar panels bring with them pollution in their manufacturing. We need to reduce our energy consumption in order to have a healthier planet and in order to have healthier communities and healthier economies. If I could also just add that, in the current situation where we have such a need to reduce energy consumption because of all, particularly the climate issue, but also pollution, and we have a massive problem with unemployment and job insecurity. It's utter total madness that most economists, even many ecological economists, will talk about the need to create jobs through innovation, through creating more technology. This is a mantra within the econometric thinking, that we need more technology to create more jobs. Technology, by definition, is meant to relieve us of work. So it's an insanity to keep down this path of ever more technology, ever more energy consumption, and ever more unemployment and destruction of livelihoods. Of course, we are not arguing that we shouldn't have any technology. We're not arguing that we can do away with all the technologies we have overnight. We're particularly talking about how the trade treaties are encouraging a path of this corporate monoculture that uses more and more energy and more technology and is destroying livelihoods by the billions. Because as these farmers, as I was describing in Ladakh, as people are pulled away from the land and away from producing all their basic needs from their local resources into these giant cities, we are now talking about billions of people losing their livelihoods and scrabbling just to survive, fighting each other for those few jobs. And I just want to add that when you do rob men of the ability to provide for themselves and their families, it's a recipe for violence. Combined with that is a global monoculture which romanticizes a white Western monocultural identity. So you're also at the same time robbing people of their identity, the right to their skin color, the right to their language, the right to their diverse identities as cultures and as unique individuals. So you rob people, and especially men react violently, of their self-respect and their ability to provide for themselves. It's a recipe for violence, it's a recipe for fundamentalism, it's a recipe for terrorism. We should come back a bit more, Charles. Well, can I just quickly also, I wanted to point out when Charles was talking about debt earlier, I wanted to point out that the US debt is the biggest of all, and that we need to look at how the trade, the deregulation, and the debt foundations have driven the industrialized countries also in a direction that's disastrous. And we need to be really clear about the growing poverty within the industrialized countries, how now even in the middle classes, it has changed dramatically over the last 30 years, that you now need, usually both husband and wife to work to just pay for the mortgage, pay for education, pay for healthcare. So there's this rat race where people are working longer and harder to just stay in place. And I think this is a very important message for people who will say, well, we can't change this system because people don't want change. People don't want to change. Well, we have a very powerful story to tell about the change that has come about because of this debt and speculation in the global economy, because of this global economic system. We want to alert people to the changes that have already come about and that will continue to bear down on us until we get a powerful people's movement. And we're not talking now about urging everyone to go out in the streets. We are talking about a campaign-like commitment to be an activist in terms of raising awareness. Help us get the big picture out. Spread the word, get the films out, the website, get Charles's books, get people to know what is really going on and bringing such dramatic change in our society. Let's stop blaming ourselves and the other. Let's not blame even an individual company like Monsanto. It really doesn't help us to make the systemic change that we need to make. Let's really look at this in a systemic, holistic way and start right now by supporting the more local structures that can take you beyond debt into a gift economy, into reciprocity, into local relational ways of being that are far healthier. Apologies again if I went on for too long. Charles, over to you. People really want to hear from you.
A few months ago, I met a guy who worked at Monsanto. Really nice guy, who was even idealistic and really sincerely wants to make the world a better place and believes that he is. And that's because of the story that he's living in. And I was thinking the same thing when you mentioned those factory owners in the third world, when the fair trade inspector comes, they clean everything up, and make everything look nice, and then he leaves, and things go back to normal. If you're socialized in the dominant culture, the first reaction to a story like that would be, wow, what a horrible person, what a hypocrite. But what exactly is the context for that happening? Well, he's maybe in very fierce competition with other subcontractors in that area to squeeze out a profit. And why is there such fierce competition to sacrifice everything for the bottom line? It could be, and probably is, because they're under debt pressure. Ultimately, the way that debt works is you lend a certain amount of money into an economy and you extract even more money from that economy, which fundamentally puts everybody into competition. So to set up a system in which there is never enough, in which you're always in competition for never enough, and then to condemn people for doing what it takes to survive in that system, that is hypocrisy. And that's why we can also see, third world factory abuses as yet another symptom of a deeper problem. And we have a few more minutes before we want to transition to Q&A. So I want to again dip into what Helena was talking about, where do we go from here? What are some of the solutions? I think that this movement that Helena was talking about is already happening, and probably everybody on this call is part of that movement, even if you haven't really been articulating it as such. But the things that many and more people are naturally attracted to are fully aligned with a movement toward reconnection, localization, and ecological healing. I'll put it like that. If you are attracted to holistic medicine that doesn't depend on this kind of industrial pharmaceutical complex in which medicines are produced by distant experts and applied formulaically based on lists of indications and symptoms, but you're more attracted to a personal relationship with a healer who has insight into you and probably usually uses natural remedies that are from living beings. You're part of this movement. If you're attracted to local food, if you go to farmers markets and you wish that there was even more of that, then you're part of this movement. If you are resisting the factory model of education, in which curriculum is produced in distant, boards of education or departments of education, and then mechanically applied in a standardized way to all the students and enforced through standardized testing, which they call accountability, then you're also part of this movement. So I think what we're doing here in this teleseminar, and I know I'm doing this in my work a lot, is to bring a little bit more consciousness and to say, if you are involved in all of these things, or any of these things, you are part of a movement, and to give some awareness of the larger context that has brought us to the state of disconnection that we are at now. And that also, when you have a systemic understanding of things, then you are empowered politically, and not only in your personal choices, because as Helena said, you can raise awareness, you can shed light on the systemic dynamics that are happening. And maybe you're not going to be able to offer a cogent disquisition on global debt or something like that, but you can speak to people's intuition that there's something wrong about this. There's something wrong here. You're not supposed to graduate from college with a debt burden that takes 20 years to pay off. You're not, and there's something wrong with this whole thing that Helena was talking about, the endless growth, the more and more jobs, more and more production. It seems kind of crazy, but the economic logic is difficult to counter, because if you don't have more and more demand, then because of technology, fewer and fewer people will be there to produce the same amount of stuff. So the only way you can maintain full employment is to produce more and more stuff and consume more and more stuff. Therefore, it's important to find new markets and to increase demand. And all of that logic is necessary in a growth-dependent economy, and a debt-based economy is a growth-dependent economy. And so, I mean, I've written about that, but I guess I just want to validate some of these intuitions. And maybe as we, if this is your temperament, if you have kind of a leaning toward systems level understanding, and I'm not saying that this is the only path. I think it's maybe healthy for everybody to have a little bit of that awareness, but maybe your path is towards establishing a local farmers market, or there's endless work to do as part of this movement. And I think that we can trust the things that call to us. I'm reminded of my brother. He's an organic farmer, and he's had some unpleasant interactions with the Department of Agriculture. They're setting these new agricultural standards that are all in the name of food safety. But so you have to fence off your fields. You can't allow dogs onto your field anymore because their feces might get on the vegetables. But now you can't have a dog there to chase off the deer and the woodchucks. So now you have to have fences and technological means to, and now because they're worried about avian flu, they're talking about requiring all chickens to be indoors, or to have some way to prevent wild birds from getting too near the chickens. And all of these regulations, they're all by these very well-meaning bureaucrats who take for granted certain assumptions about the way the world works, about how disease is propagated. And I'm not going to bother to deconstruct those right now, but I guess the point I'm making is that the radicalism that we are stepping into extends to all of the foundational paradigms and institutions of our system, including health and sanitation, including, well, you can take it as far as you want, but just look at the, I think I'm going to hold it right here because I'm about to go off on a different topic.
Well, just wanted to say that the whole point about regulations is incredibly important as part of this systemic picture. And what I've seen is that when there is a clear, not very complicated systemic picture, it can help people who are starting farmers markets or are opposing the industrial education system, or who are working for alternative medicine, to see more clearly how important it is what they're doing and to strengthen those activities. And what we are also saying is that with that bigger picture, all these various groups and individuals can link hands to demand the systemic shift. And part of that picture does include recognizing that most of the regulations brought in now in the name of health and safety are destructive. But that takes a little bit of reading. We do have a book that Steve Gorlick in our organization wrote. It's called Small is Beautiful, Big is Subsidized. And among the subsidies, we're talking about all the supports that governments give to big business and destroy small business. And so that is, it does require a little bit of reading and so on, but I think with that bigger picture where we see how the regulations, how the taxes and subsidies are all supporting destructive monocultural and, as it turns out, corporate production, and how that is destroying the life-affirming, holistic, peace-based, spiritually based knowledge that has been with us from the beginning of our history, how it's destroying the community fabric which is how we evolved. We evolved in groups, in intergenerational groups, connected, supporting one another. Those cooperative relationships are vital for our health and well-being. And there's so much evidence now. Every day we get new statistics about how community and connection to nature is the foundation for our physical and mental, spiritual well-being. So really, I do believe that the big picture can strengthen all those activities that are going on, but that keep getting overwhelmed by this crazy, destructive economic system. So I think with the bigger picture, all the various groups can link hands for systemic change. I hope, Charles, at some point, I wonder whether you should say something about positive money. We had sort of said in our description that we'd be talking about some of the solutions that are being proposed. And I wonder what you say about positive money and what you think.
I'll just give a 60-second thing on that because I really want to get hear from the people listening.
Yeah.
I'll just say that when you realize that debt and money even is nothing but a social agreement, then the next thought is, well, why have we agreed on a money system that systemically generates competition, scarcity, and endless growth? We could agree on another money system. Well, what would that be? So there are various proposals, alternatives to the current money system where money is not brought into being as interest-bearing debt, but it's brought into being some other way. Positive money is one of these examples where the government or some other entity, probably the government, simply prints a certain amount of money. But instead of borrowing from a Federal Reserve or a central bank, that's how money is created today. But the government could just print it. Why not? And there are other, I like positive money. In my book, I describe a different alternative that I like even better, which is negative interest money, decaying money. But, I think that whatever we end up with in a more beautiful world will be something that we really cannot necessarily envision beforehand. It'll come through experimentation. And I think so the first step is to realize that we can experiment, that there are alternatives, and hey, let's try some. And even knowing that, when, I'm not going to say if, but I'm going to say when the current dominant money system falls apart, and it will, unless you believe that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, it will fall apart. When it does, then we have alternatives to try instead of grasping even more tightly to something that doesn't work. So that's the 2-minute part. And are we ready for?
Yes, please. We've had some questions.
So I hope you can all hear me right now. Let me know if you can't. Okay. Looks like my audio is on. So now I want to officially open the conversation up to everyone else and invite you, if you have a question you'd like to pose to Charles or Helena, to please type it into the chat box. So we've already received a few questions. The first one is, what about microcredit programs? Do they help people or just reinforce the system?
Oh boy, don't get us started.
Yeah, Charles, do you want to talk about it?
Oh geez, I mean, okay. I can see that there are circumstances where they could be useful. If you have a fully monetized economy where there are people who have no access to credit from the banks, say Detroit, perhaps, they might be useful. But what usually happens is you go into places that are not fully monetized. You make a loan to, some woman in Pakistan so she can buy a milk cow, and then she goes into business selling milk, and makes enough money to pay back the loan with interest. Well, the question is, that money that she made from her friends and neighbors, where is that coming from? You lent $1,000 for her cow, and she has to pay back. And some of these have exorbitant interest rates too. She has to pay back $1,500 or something like that. Well, where's that extra $500 coming from? these villagers, they don't have money. Where is it coming from? It can only come from them getting employment in the money economy or from the export of their natural resources. So basically what you're doing, it's what debt always does. It's been a chief device of colonialism. Get them into debt, and then they will be helpless. They will have to follow the program. And it's still happening today. So I'm very skeptical of microcredit in the third world, but I don't want to dismiss it entirely in all circumstances.
I guess I would say yes, that I think again in the slums of the third world where people have become totally dependent on this global dominant economy, it may be helpful. And there are some groups that don't charge exorbitant interest rates. But as Charles was saying, most of the microcredit in the third world has gone into rural areas and introduced debt where there wasn't debt before. And people should have been skeptical when the World Bank was promoting microcredit, when Bill Clinton was promoting it. But we were very alone 20 years ago also trying to criticize it because it became very fashionable. People thought this is what was going to solve poverty worldwide.
Okay. So we just so you know, we have a lot of questions coming in. So hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them, but someone said maybe 2 minutes per answer would be a good amount, just so we can make make sure that everyone has their concerns, addressed.
I'll try. Yeah.
It's all right. So the next question is, why can't we call a spade and declare the corporation an illegal business entity? Any thoughts on that?
I think that I think the corporation is the most convenient way to perpetrate the system that is going on, that is operating today. But I don't think that the crux of the problem is necessarily the corporate form of organization. But again, I think it's also one more quick thing. I think that, again, it's a useful thought to entertain, that because it says, well, we don't have to take the current system for granted. We could eliminate or circumscribe the corporation, which is, conventional economics takes the corporation or the firm as something that's written into the laws of physics. But it is actually something that is created through politics, through law, and it's defined through law, and its rights can be circumscribed through law. And we could, again, so it's an agreement, and we could have other agreements that limit what corporations are able to do. So worth thinking about.
I would also just like to add that our friend and colleague David Corton, he wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World, and his point was that publicly traded corporations are problematic in their structure, and ideally we probably would want to move towards eliminating them. But again, I think we have to be very strategic. We have to look at where we are today and how can we move forward. So we're not going to be able, first of all, it's not going to be very constructive to just work at the national level, because if our governments open up the doors to global trade and investment, then trying to curtail the national corporations' activities is only going to make the local and national economy weaker. So the first thing is to close the door to these completely unaccountable outside giant banks and corporations. And that would best happen through international collaboration. So another way to put it is that we need to lobby for new and fundamentally different trade and investment treaties, so that we insist that our governments go back to the same table where they signed away our rights, this time with civic society at the table, no private business at the table, civic society. We're talking about democracy. So I think that's going to be the first step to start curtailing the mobility of these giants. And then looking at the national levels, I think it's very likely we would want to eliminate the publicly traded corporation. Privately owned businesses can change, and we're seeing that already now in the global economy.
So we've got a lot of questions about the solution to all of this. Feeling like the problem is big and complex and not knowing where to start, especially for people who are concerned with issues like paying rent that confront them on a very immediate basis. We've had a couple questions about wanting to hear more about positive and negative money, and also a question about whether a citizen's income could be part of the solution.
Charles, why don't you say a bit more about positive and negative money?
Well, okay. I mean, I mentioned it before. The idea of negative interest money basically means that money is like everything else in the universe. It decays with time. So if you try to hold on to your wealth, you lose your wealth. Therefore, it recreates the dynamics of traditional cultures where you're only able to maintain your wealth by sharing it, essentially. And therefore, it allows zero interest lending to happen. If you have zero interest lending, then you don't have a growth imperative anymore, and you don't have a context that generates competition endemically. I mean, you still could have competition, but it isn't mandated by the system. And there's a lot else I could say about it, but it gets very technical. But I do want to also mention citizens' income, basic income. I think that that's a very important idea, because it removes that, one of the reasons, one of the drivers and justifications for the growth economy now is that you have to provide jobs, otherwise people won't make money. They won't be able to survive. They need their job. They need their money. And most people today, when they're looking for a job, it's not because they're not looking for something that they're going to love to do so much that they would do it even if there weren't money involved. Why do you drive a bus 8 hours a day? Why do you do all this work? For most people, why do you work at McDonald's? It's because you need the money. Well, if you took that away and said, okay, we guarantee survival with a basic income, then the whole structure of the economy changes, because no longer are you going to be able to set up enterprises that depend on people doing tedious, degrading work because they're forced to survive. So you have to design fulfillment into the industrial economy. And again, this is a really big topic, and I don't have time to do it justice right now. So you can read about it in Sacred Economics, and there's probably more recent stuff too that does even a better job of it.
I would also say that, again, when we look at localization as a way of starting to solve the problems, we do see many initiatives now that are very positive. And when it comes to debt and finance, they include local communities getting together and simply setting up a fund, a community fund, to help revitalize the local economy. It includes things like helping a group of farmers to buy a new small truck, or having a local processing place where they can process a lot of their foodstuffs. It includes helping to, fund an initiative at a local alternative school, perhaps to lower the costs for people in the local community. One of my favorite new initiatives in England is also a CSA, a community-supported agriculture initiative, where they are asking members who buy to contribute a bit of money so that they can provide that local healthy food to members of the community who can't afford to buy it at the price they need to charge. So they're basically reaching out to the local community and saying, can you help create a finance possibility for local people to also buy this delicious, healthy food? So there's a multitude of things, and generally there are also local credit unions, alternative banks that are doing a better job. Now, sometimes there it's hard to know just how much better it is than the normal big banks. But there is a multitude of solutions at that human scale, local level that are proliferating. And I urge all of you to follow our Planet Local series where we highlight these examples from around the world. And I hope you join the IAL, the International Alliance for Localization, and we will get more information and the ability to communicate with others who are part of the Alliance. Also, I'll wait for that. I'll come back to what I was going to say now, because I was probably already took my 2 minutes. So next question.
So the next question is, money only comes from other people, not from the earth or animals or trees. So people will naturally go to populated places to get more money. Is urbanization an inevitable part of a currency-based society?
Well, I think that urbanization has been completely linked to this very destructive dominant economy. There is no doubt that remember this, it all started with traders who were profiting literally from slavery, from forcing people to stop producing for their own needs, to produce for Europe. And usually one thing, you become the tea center for us. You will become the tin mining country. You will become the ones that produce the coffee or the whatever it might be. Now that imposition, which happened through force as started, was very much linked to a process of urbanization in the Western world, where people had been enclosed, had been forced off their land to become cheap labor for these mass-produced natural resources that came from around the world. And the process now continues where, for the McDonald's and the Monsantos, who, by the way, are not all evil individuals, but as structures, operate in an essentially evil way, for these giants, having populations concentrated in a few urban centers is absolutely essential. They cannot deliver to the millions of villages around the world. And so they've also lobbied governments to create the infrastructure, the ever wider roads, the ever bigger ports, the ever bigger airports, to concentrate populations where, and to have the infrastructure that facilitates that delivery. So the delivery of money, yes, is also part of it. But one thing I do want to stress is that let's not look at debt and speculation in isolation. Let's not look at money in isolation. Let's always look at it in its context. If there's anything that we're trying to say, it's again and again and again, let's try to have a contextual, holistic, systemic analysis in order to make the systemic, holistic transformation we need to do. If that was unfortunately 2 minutes.
Okay.
Let's move on.
Sure. The next question is, do you agree with Nicole Foss's predictions of a near future economic collapse?
In a way, we already have an economic collapse. It depends on who you ask. But still, the system right now is still kind of working for most people. You still go to the supermarket, there's still food on the shelves. So in a sense, we have not reached a collapse yet. I'm always surprised by the capacity of all organisms to survive, to live. So you have a relative on his deathbed, and it looks like he can't possibly survive another day, but he hangs on for 2 weeks. And I feel like our social systems are like that too. They're hanging on longer than anyone could expect. I don't know how soon the collapse will come.
I think, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just think it's dangerous to make predictions like that. But I agree, it could happen soon. I don't know.
I actually, I don't know, one of the reasons I've been running and trying to shake people into awareness about this economic system is that I worked with a Swiss economist many years ago who had studied the origins of money, the alchemy of money, and the sort of rise of the dependence on money. And he got me thinking that perhaps one of the very last things to collapse would be the money system. As we have allowed it to move away from any real value, any real connection to natural resources, to, as the earlier question was saying, this water, the soil, the seeds we depend on. As we have allowed this disconnection, turned it over into unaccountable, invisible hands, these global, and now allowed it also to be speculated on. And by the way, now we have robots and computerized algorithms determining the value of our currencies, of our seeds, of our water. So we've allowed the creation of a sort of machine-like system that is only running on our ignorance. It has no real value. However, as long as we remain ignorant, it could continue to destroy biodiversity. We've got to remember it is structurally looking for the trillions and the quadrillions, need monoculture. Diversity is inefficient. For all big businesses, standardization is essential. And so you have a machine-like system which cannot really tolerate life. It's a collision course between this artificial system and life. However, what I see happening is that people, societies, health, certainly democracy, are crashing. And in the meanwhile, the financial, completely artificial system is living on. Every day on the news, we are told that the most important thing is the thriving of the market. Is the market doing well? Is the market doing well? Are we consuming enough? Are you out there consuming enough to keep it going? So I think we need to realize that yes, Nicole's predictions sound very convincing, but I'm not so convinced. And I think, and it's because, as I say, the blindness of our political leaders who keep pushing this direction, and the blindness even of the activists at the grassroots. Now, we should remember that the opposite of blindness is awareness, is consciousness. That could spread very quickly, but I think it needs to be articulated in clear enough language and be holistic enough to be really meaningful. So, sorry, did I take too long on that?
Actually, I want to add something to it, though, because I have a really cool thought, and it's short.
Good.
Fundamentally, the financial system that we have today can continue as long as there is economic growth. The problems with inequality of wealth can be fixed, and the system can keep going as long as there's growth. And what is growth? Growth is the conversion of relationships into services and the conversion of nature into product. That means that as long as there is still something left of beauty and relationship in this world, that there's a market opportunity, there's a growth opportunity. So I don't think that we can rely on economic collapse as the savior that will come and deliver us from the situation. I kind of agree with Helena that maybe this is the last thing that would collapse.
So we have a couple questions about going beyond the systemic diagnosis and beyond an analysis of the problem, and asking whether there is a clear roadmap or action plan on how to, I guess, synthesize some of these alternatives that you've discussed into something coherent, whether there's a platform that addresses people's needs to, act together and not reinvent the wheel or diversify social capital's efforts. Another questioner is asking, could you give some practical steps of how to break away from this situation for people living in cities specifically? Any thoughts on any of that?
I should mention that we are developing a workshop, which is a sort of DIY workshop model that would help people to get together in their local communities and to think through this from this systemic point of view. And it will start with a film, where we have voices from all over the world, but then a deeper discussion and some tools that can help that process. And we very much see so many initiatives towards localization in and from the big cities, where there is then both a reconnection to the land, very importantly to the farmers outside, but also to converting spaces, green spaces, to food production in the city where possible. But do beware of urban ag that emphasizes high-rise agriculture and highly inefficient, energy-intensive approaches. But so from the city, there are lots of initiatives, whether around money, around health, house building, energy systems. There's a lot happening in community energy systems. So we are trying to develop. We will keep adding to and changing this workshop model that we'll just be completing. We've been doing some pilots over the last 6 months. So we will be rolling that out in, I would say, within a month. Also, we feel it's really important to sort of very simply spell out that there are these key approaches. The first one we urge everybody to keep in mind is to connect. It's all about connection. Connect more deeply to others. So we really urge you to not look at this from that isolated individual perspective that everyone has been encouraged to do. Get together with some like-minded friends or colleagues, maybe only 1 or 2, maybe up to 20. Make it a practice to deepen your connections by being willing to be vulnerable, willing to be open. This is something that we've been trained away from. We all have to appear perfect. I don't need anyone. I'm perfectly happy. I'm perfectly healthy. No. Exposing our vulnerabilities, getting deeper and deeper connection is vital. Also, that deeper connection to nature. Help your children to get out into nature in a more meditative, connecting way, not just throwing balls around. And then we say, as the second step is jointly look at how can you educate. So connect, educate. Educate means getting that awareness of this wholeness, so that whatever you do is feeding that holistic renewal or rebirth or restructuring towards the health and happiness we all long for, that beautiful world that Charles writes about. So the second step is to both educate yourself and then as an activism, spread the word. Put much more effort. Any of you who are funders, please fund the rethinking part of these efforts, not just the action, individual action project. Because we need to get the word out to promote small scale on a large scale, to promote the local on a global scale, to promote the global through global collaboration and deeper information exchange. So connect, educate, and then we think it's helpful to separate in terms of activities, resistance and renewal. I won't go into all the details why, but there is an intellectual fabric that goes with the resistance that has to do with the analysis, that has to do with understanding the dominant tools. In the renewal part, we need to change our personality. We need to sink down into a more holistic, embodied beingness where we de-intellectualize. And that's one of the key ingredients in terms of reconnection to others in nature. So connect, educate, resist, renew. And the fifth is celebrate. Whenever you can, stop for a minute and celebrate the beauty and the joy that is still there. Connect and celebrate so that you have much more time for the face-to-face, vital, real culture, making music together, eating together, celebrating life. That was a very long one, but I think important.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm a little bit weary of blueprints and roadmaps and action plans. So many of them come from the ways of doing things that we're familiar with. And in subtle ways, they are part of the system of global domination. So, I've been actually going through something of this on a personal level where I've had this health crisis, and it's made me unable to do more and more and more of what I've been doing. The old logic that I was operating by said, if what I'm doing has an impact, and to have a bigger impact, I've got to do more. And but yet sometimes I run into people who with much less effort are seemingly accomplishing more than I am, because things fall into place around them somehow. So I want to just offer permission, in case it's needed, to say that sometimes this process of serving the dream of this planet, serving the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, might involve doing less of the doing that had been unquestioned before. I have a mentor who I was checking in with her. I said, well, I've been really attracted to stillness. I've been really attracted to walking in nature, not as advice to accomplish more, but just for its own sake. And there's my inner revolutionary leftist that says, Charles, you're malingering. You're indulging in some, privileged bourgeois luxury that most people can't afford. Get out there and work harder, man. And my mentor said, that's the same patriarchal dominating mindset that's at the root of this problem to begin with. What kind of world do you want to create? So I've been allowing myself to pull back a bit, to go into maybe a phase of renewal and stillness. I believe that what will come from it will be even more useful than what I've been doing, but I'm not doing it for that reason. It's following a different logic that is not on the roadmaps that I was given. And I think that on a systems level, our society will and needs to enter a similar point of surrender. I noticed that a lot of the urgency, for example, the urgency around climate change, we've got to do something, the window of opportunity is shrinking, is leading to, one, to give even more power to the people who hold the reins of power already, who have the means to act, and secondly, encouraging kind of more of the same. Because what is on the menu in the policy world for more action is often ends up being things like biofuels or geoengineering or monetization of carbon markets or something like that, that actually, big hydro, nuclear power, things that actually end up worsening the problem in unforeseen ways. So I think part of the revolution that we're in, it goes all the way to that level, where we really let go of, and maybe I'm not saying that we don't do strategic things, and I'm not saying we don't do political action in the conventional sense, but we don't take it for granted as the only way to do things. We open ourselves up to different avenues of service that sometimes look like they're turning backwards and doing less. That's been, anyway, I'm just offering that as my path recently.
I do want to just add, Charles, that what we're talking about with the connection and the renewal part within this sort of five-part formula, which is a bit of a blueprint, but it is saying exactly that the deeper connection is all about slowing down and listening, and precisely the need for that, because that's what we've been trained away from. And the same thing with the renewal. It's exactly that. It's opening up to a different way of being. We got a lot more questions.
So yeah, we have about 10 minutes left and about 5 questions or so, I think. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. Next one is about the NEED Act, asking whether you're aware of it creates debt-free money from the federal government and spends it into circulation at federal, state, and local levels. This is to be used not just for payroll, but also for contractual needs of the government, including infrastructure, education, and health. Do you have any thoughts on the NEED Act or any similar policies?
Well, just my very quick thought would be that it worries me that people don't have a global enough perspective to pay attention to the fact that, in a way, if these trade treaties are allowed to be ratified, it makes a nonsense of any of those attempts. So I would like to see all of those attempts essentially realizing that we've got to start by preventing that craziness. Because, you know, if our government on the one hand has signed an agreement saying that, yes, you can sue us if you do anything to impede your profit-making potential, and that also means to curtail your ability, private banks, to create money out of thin air. And you know, that floods the market. And let's also remember that that big money is funding the big media. And so essentially now the global media is deciding who's going to be our president or prime minister. It's the global capital that goes into that, and it's the, you know, the globalized billionaires and part of that. So I would say good idea, but again, we need the context.
So the next question asks, I enjoyed the term casino economy. Could one of you speak a bit more about its meaning?
Oh, I mean, it's used a bit loosely, but I think it generally refers to speculative activity that doesn't produce any real wealth. You know, money is changing hands, someone gets rich, someone wins, someone loses, but no actual wealth is created, just as in a casino. So a lot of the financial markets operate that way. They've become so detached from real world activities that they have almost no meaning, although they have devastating effects.
And that they are gambling. You know, here they are essentially speculating on the value of our water, the value of our seeds, the value of our currencies, which then determined, because we're so trade dependent, and the value of our currency changes, the price of everything we buy changes. And this is some people sitting playing in front of a computer, gambling and competing. So it is really a casino that runs our lives and determines, you know, whether we have jobs or not, how much our mortgages cost, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question is about a court case happening in Canada. It says, in Canada, the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform has been challenging the government in the courts in order to have the Bank of Canada exercise their constitutional rights to issue money to cities, municipalities, and governments. This would allow governments to fund social and economic infrastructure without having to pay interest to commercial banks. Do you think this is a viable solution, and how do you prevent governments from abusing this and causing runaway inflation?
I think it's an excellent idea. And the bugbear of runaway inflation gets invoked all the time. And it's historically highly questionable whether runaway inflation, like hyperinflation, ever happens when there isn't some serious curtailment of supply. Now, moderate inflation or even high inflation, that certainly can happen. But if you think about it, who does inflation really hurt? If wages are rising as fast as prices, then if you live paycheck to paycheck, inflation does not hurt you. It only hurts you if you are a creditor, because then people can repay you in cheaper money. And it's to your advantage if you're a debtor. That's why in ordinary political relationships. The conservatives are in favor of, generally speaking, tight monetary policy and high interest rates, and the liberals want loose monetary policy and low interest rates, because high interest rates help the rich, help those who have money, and low interest rates help the poor. And so anyway, that's a very complicated topic, but I think I like that idea, because essentially, I mean, that's essentially, I wouldn't call it exactly positive money, but it is the creation of money without interest-bearing debt, and it changes everything.
And it sounds very similar to the Need Act earlier. And again, I would just urge people to encourage that we get that movement that prevents the ratification of the treaty.
Right. So the next question is, do you believe that energy descent, as described by Nicole Foss and David Holmgren, is inevitable? If that happens, won't that totally undermine corporate power and lead to corporate collapse?
Well, again, just very quickly, I think that if we look holistically and we see how the deregulation of banks and financial institutions has led to this creation of more and more money going in the wrong direction, then we're seeing them doing unbelievably wasteful and expensive activities like gas fracking and all kinds of excavation that the peak oil people are saying, oh, we're going to see a dramatic change in the world because the price of oil is going to go up and then everything will change. Well, it's not a holistic analysis enough. That's the problem. And please, I just want to urge people, as I say, holistic analysis, that is something that could happen quickly and that could help us all move in the same direction. It's not, I get the feeling very often that people don't want to look at the big picture because then they see that the system is so big. No, actually looking at the big picture, you'll see it's full of hot air and full of ignorance. And that part of that is, a big part of that is our ignorance. So I think, yeah, I don't think that the energy descent will happen in the way that David and Nicole, they're both friends, I respect them a lot, and I think they've done fabulous work, but I don't think that it's going to happen in the way they describe.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of it as well. I think one thing that could change, though, and that would be very significant, is the shift away from centralized energy. And certainly petroleum and nuclear power even more lends itself to centralized energy distribution systems. Now they're trying to do it with solar too. The solar in many states in the US, at the behest of the utilities, state governments are restricting or even prohibiting rooftop solar in favor of enormous solar installations that devastate desert ecosystems and create the need for transmission lines and all that. But centralized institutions like to hold on to the power, literally. So I think we do have an opportunity here, whether or not the total amount of energy used in BTUs or something increases or decreases. I'm not sure if it's going to necessarily decrease, but we do have a very good opportunity to decentralize the energy infrastructure.
So we have 2 or 3 questions left, but we've officially run out of time, so I just want to let people go if they have to. Helena and Charles, are you able to stay on for 5 more minutes, or do you have to run as well?
I'm rather tired, okay. But if there's one really juicy one, why don't you pick the juiciest of the 3, and we'll do that as a conclusion.
All right, let's see. Oh, we just got a new one. Okay, how about this one? Do you think forming an organized political movement to lobby governments to change the nature of money is feasible? If one country changes to zero interest money or citizen payments, how does that affect their standing internationally?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's complicated. What one government can do is highly circumscribed by the financial markets and the bond market, not to mention the collusion that happens behind the scenes. So I don't think that, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's room for experimentation, but as far as, a movement or an organization to lobby for it, that's happening. People are confused between movements and organizations. You do not create a movement. Movements create you.
I do think that, again, that bigger picture awareness that starts by recognizing that it's a global system that's affecting everything we do, affecting our thinking, our schooling. So we want a deeper understanding, which means understanding what's going on in those countries over there, in India and China, and on the ground. And I believe that through more holistic, systemic awareness building across borders, that a movement could emerge that would make it easier for several countries. I think it'll probably be a group. I wrote a book with Ross Jackson, and we were talking about a breakaway strategy. A breakaway strategy whereby several nations together start forming alliances. This is already happening, that nations are doing that. In South America, and also in the whole so-called third world, vis-a-vis the global north, have created, breakaway groups. However, sadly, they're still operating on the same principle of more trade and the same growth dominant agenda. However, breaking away to start this essentially a systemic direction in the opposite direction is entirely possible, and it would actually cost less money. You'll be working with ecological and human needs, so it would actually be a relatively easy path. The big obstacle is the system that too many people still don't understand. But I do think that we may end up seeing very positive change much faster than we think. I think that's a possibility.